A flight attendant acted aggressively toward a black CEO, but the CEO calmly took control of the situation, turning the tables and leaving the crew stunned. He jammed his elbow into the black CEO's ribcage, thinking a little pain would force submission. He didn't realize the CEO could turn aggression into instant consequences. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always snaps against real authority. The shoulder bump landed hard, too hard to be an accident. Dr. Kalen Reimer barely flinched, though the impact jolted him slightly against the side of his first-class seat. He turned his head calmly, meeting the eyes of the flight attendant who had just passed. The man, tall, clean-shaven, with sharp brows and tighter shoulders than necessary, gave him a brief glance that might have passed as neutral to anyone else. But Kalen saw it. Not just a glance. A test. "Apologies," the attendant said without pause, his voice laced with a stiffness that wasn't quite professional. Kalen didn't respond. He straightened his blazer with one slow, deliberate motion, then returned his gaze to the small monitor in front of him, ignoring the dull ache that lingered along his right shoulder blade. There was no reason to escalate. Not yet. The cabin of Skylumen Flight 882 buzzed with the low hum of pre-flight preparation. Overhead compartments clicked shut. A few rows away, a toddler let out a sharp giggle before being hushed by his father. The atmosphere should have been routine, but Kalen felt something colder slipping under the surface, an energy too brittle, too focused in his direction. The same attendant returned 2 minutes later, clipboard in hand, jaw set. "May I see your boarding pass again, sir?" Kalen raised an eyebrow just slightly. "You scanned it already. It didn't register in our system. Standard check." He held the clipboard as if it were a badge of authority, angled just enough to create tension. Kalen didn't argue. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and handed over the pass, watching the man's fingers tighten around the edges. A flicker of something unreadable moved across the attendant's face. Anxious resentment, perhaps, but it vanished quickly. "Dr. Reimer," the attendant read aloud. "Reimer Tech Systems." Kalen said nothing. He watched, assessing, not reacting but remembering. The man's name tag read Marek Dolan. His movements were precise but impatient. His tone clipped with something personal. Kalen knew better than to mistake this for routine. Marek returned the boarding pass and offered a thin smile. "You just looked important. Wanted to make sure everything matched." Kalen tucked the pass back into his jacket. "It does." For a brief moment, their eyes locked. Neither man blinked. Around them, the rest of the first-class cabin continued unbothered, coats folded, flight safety cards ignored. But Kalen now understood the game. This wasn't about procedure. It was about something else entirely. As Marek turned and walked down the aisle, Kalen watched his stride, too controlled, too pointed. There was pressure behind that man's performance. Not the kind you show in training, but the kind that makes people unpredictable. Outside the cabin window, the tarmac glowed under afternoon haze. The jet bridge retracted with a mechanical shudder. A voice crackled overhead. The pilot's greeting, weather report, estimated arrival time to Vensford City. Kalen heard none of it. He glanced toward the overhead bin where his slim briefcase rested. Inside was simulation data tied to a global aviation software initiative, confidential figures, projected modeling, encryption protocols. He had carried more valuable tech in his career, but never during a flight that already felt like a silent interrogation. Just before the cabin doors sealed, Marek passed by again. This time he leaned in. Too close. "Funny," he murmured, just above the sound of the engine spool. "Some people really know how to act important." Kalen didn't turn. He didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened by a fraction. Marek moved on, a quiet smirk playing at his lips as he disappeared behind the curtain that divided first class from the galley. Kalen exhaled slowly, reaching up to adjust the airflow dial above his head. His mind, once focused entirely on the partnership waiting in Vensford, now recalibrated. Something was off. Not just a difficult crew member, but a target drawn in chalk around his presence. He closed his eyes for a moment and let his instincts scan the situation. The tension wasn't just personality-based. It felt organized, intentional. Behind him, a passenger coughed. A bag zipped shut. The safety video began to play. Kalen opened his eyes, the brightness from the screen flashing across his face. In another life, in another version of himself, he might have snapped back, reported the man, demanded immediate accountability. But not here. Not yet. His goal had narrowed. Remain calm, observe everything, and keep the briefcase, and himself, untouched. The engines surged beneath the fuselage as Skylumen Flight 882 began its taxi. Wheels hummed against concrete, aligning for takeoff. Kalen settled back, one hand resting casually over the armrest, the other lightly touching the side of his briefcase. He didn't know yet what Marek Dolan's problem was, but he did know how to survive pressure, and he had no idea the flight would test every part of his patience and strength. The bottle hit the tray with a loud clack, the sound sharp enough to silence the quiet hum of conversation around Kalen's row. Half its contents splashed forward, soaking the edge of his folder and a corner of the cream-colored documents tucked neatly beneath. A startled breath caught in Kalen Reimer's throat, not from the cold but from the precision of the act. "I asked for water, not a flood," Kalen said, his voice level, his eyes lifting slowly to meet the gaze of the man before him. Marek Dolan didn't flinch. The flight attendant simply stood there, jaw set, his hand still gripping the beverage cart like he wanted to drive it through the cabin wall. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "My apologies, sir," he said with forced politeness. "Turbulence, you understand." There had been no turbulence. Not yet. Kalen reached calmly for a napkin and began blotting the edge of the wet page, one that held proprietary data simulations developed over 9 months by his team. He was aware of every eye now turned toward him. Subtle, flickering glances from across the aisle, behind seats, even the reflection in the window, a quiet chorus of confusion and discomfort blooming among the passengers. Marek leaned in, pulling a towel from the cart. "Let me help," he said with an edge that didn't belong in customer service. Kalen stiffened slightly. "That won't be necessary," but the towel was already pressing against his side. It wasn't a gentle dab. It was pressure, controlled, focused, and intentional. Marek's hand drove the cloth into Kalen's ribcage just beneath the armrest, grinding into bone under the pretense of assistance. Kalen winced, a small breath escaping his lips as he angled away slightly, his posture never fully breaking. He didn't speak. He didn't react. But he moved, only slightly, just enough to shift his briefcase an inch closer to the inner wall of the cabin. Away from Marek's reach, away from prying hands. And Marek saw it. His eyes flicked to the silver case, then back to Kalen. The irritation in his face deepened. Not confusion, not regret. Irritation, as if Kalen's protective instinct had offended him. "You guarding treasure in there?" Marek asked under his breath. Kalen responded without blinking. "No. Just responsibility." Something tightened behind Marek's eyes. He stepped forward, abandoning the cart momentarily, and placed himself squarely in the aisle, blocking the path completely. His shadow fell across Kalen's lap, long and dark under the overhead lights. He folded his arms, as if daring Kalen to object. Kalen stayed still, calculating. He scanned the distance to the emergency call button above him but didn't reach for it. He didn't need the drama yet. His focus sharpened inward, shifting away from the sting in his ribs and onto the man in front of him. Marek wasn't just posturing. He was pushing, baiting, for a reaction that could be twisted into justification later. A young man across the aisle whispered to his travel companion. 2 rows back, a middle-aged gentleman glanced toward the cockpit, frowning. The tension was real now. It vibrated through the floor beneath their feet and whispered through the recycled air. "I think we're done here," Kalen said finally, his tone edged with quiet command. Marek hesitated. He wasn't used to being dismissed, not by someone who didn't shout, didn't flinch, didn't feed his fire. His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned, walking back toward the galley with slow, heavy steps, each one punctuated by a stiff roll of his shoulders. As he moved, Kalen's gaze dropped to the water-streaked folder. The ink on the corner of one printed schematic had already begun to smudge. He carefully pulled the sheet free, shaking the excess droplets loose before sliding it into the inner pouch of his briefcase. Every page in that case held data capable of reshaping fuel algorithms for mid-air aircraft recalibration, a product Ribcage had spent nearly a decade building. And now it sat under threat, not from a competitor, but from a bitter man wielding a drink cart. Kalen closed the latch on the case with a soft click. Across the cabin, murmurs continued. Passengers weren't sure what they had just witnessed. Some assumed Marek was stressed. Others sensed something darker. Kalen didn't blame them. Dramatic irony was cruel that way. They saw a man in a uniform and a man in a suit and drew their own conclusions. But Kalen saw the pattern. He had studied human behavior long enough to know when the escalation wasn't random. This wasn't about spilled water. This was about control. As Marek turned the corner back into the galley, he threw a final look over his shoulder, one filled with something rawer than frustration. Humiliation, perhaps, or challenge. Kalen met his gaze for only a second, then looked away. He adjusted his breathing, let the pain in his ribs settle, and placed both hands atop the closed briefcase as though sealing something sacred beneath. The quiet warning signs were slowly forming the shape of something dangerous. Marek Dolan didn't knock or ask. He simply stepped forward. "I need to adjust your seat," he said, his voice clipped, already reaching down. "There's nothing wrong with my seat," Kalen replied, calm but clear. But Marek didn't stop. With one smooth, deliberate motion, he leaned in, and that's when it happened. His elbow slammed into Kalen's ribcage. Not a nudge, not a shift in balance. A calculated, brutal jab, driven into the soft space just below the ribs with the weight of a man who wanted it to hurt. The pain struck like a thunderclap. Kalen's breath caught in his throat as his chest seized. His right hand twitched instinctively, but he didn't retaliate. Not yet. He inhaled slowly, letting the burn spread through him like a signal, not a surrender. Marek lingered, face just inches from Kalen's. "Is something wrong?" he asked, mock innocence dripping from his tone. Kalen didn't answer. His eyes scanned the cabin without moving his head. A woman in row 4 was reading a magazine. The man near the aisle had headphones in, unaware. The tension had not yet caught up to the rest of the cabin. But it had caught Kalen. He shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting nothing, but in truth, preparing everything. His right hand hovered near his lap, not clenched but loose, flexible, coiled like a spring hidden beneath calm. Dramatic irony bloomed in the space between them. Marek mistook the silence for weakness, not knowing the man he just tried to intimidate had spent years training in the art of restraint, not retaliation. That elbow was not the first he had endured in life, but it would be the last from Marek. "You sure you're comfortable?" Marek asked, smirking now, stepping back as though he'd won something. Kalen said nothing. He observed, calculated, timed. Marek's hand reached again toward the headrest. "Let me just check the recline." "No," Kalen said firmly. Marek's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Then, feigning casualness, he reached again, this time bending slightly, pretending to inspect the seat mechanism. But what he was doing was far more deliberate. His elbow began to rise again, his body angling as if to drive the blow into the same injured spot. That's when Kalen moved. His hand shot up, not in anger, but with the precision of a practiced counter. He seized Marek's elbow in midair, locking it in a grip that was strong without being cruel. His thumb pressed behind the joint, and in one fluid motion, he turned Marek's arm backward, just enough. There was no crack, no snap, just a sharp twist of dominance. Enough to warn, enough to teach, enough to control. Marek gasped. Passengers gasped. The man with headphones yanked them off. The magazine dropped to the floor in row 4. Kalen didn't speak. He didn't need to. His grip, his posture, his stillness, all of it spoke with authority louder than words. He held the elbow suspended in that moment of total stillness, as if time itself had frozen to bear witness. Then he released. Marek stumbled backward, cradling his arm in shock. Not in pain, Kalen had been careful, but in humiliation. His cheeks flushed red, and he stood frozen in the aisle, staring at Kalen with wide, disbelieving eyes. Kalen remained seated, back straight, hands now resting softly on the armrests. A picture of composure, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Everything had changed. Marek's breath came in short, uneven puffs. His lips pressed into a pale line as he turned sharply and stormed toward the galley, his steps loud and clumsy. His posture no longer belonged to a man in charge. It belonged to someone unraveling. Around the cabin, silence hovered like mist before a storm. Passengers exchanged glances. A few reached for their phones, unsure if what they had seen was real. A flicker of justice in midair, invisible but undeniable. Kalen's ribs still ached, but his mind was sharper than ever. This was no longer about avoiding conflict. The stakes had changed. He had given one warning, measured, quiet, firm. He suspected Marek wouldn't listen. The question now was, who was Marek really working for? What game had just begun? And as Kalen exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the corridor Marek had vanished into, he knew one thing for certain. The elbow meant to break Kalen's calm had instead triggered Marek's unraveling. Marek recoiled, clutching his bent arm, his breath shallow with shock, but the pain was nothing compared to the humiliation boiling beneath his skin. His eyes darted from Kalen to the surrounding passengers. Some had witnessed the maneuver. Others looked confused, uncertain whether the confrontation had crossed the line into violence. But for Marek, it didn't matter. His authority, his image had cracked, and he needed to reclaim it fast. Without another word, he turned and stormed down the aisle toward the galley, each footfall louder than necessary, a stomping declaration of grievance. Kalen didn't move. He sat still in his seat, heart steady, posture calm. But his mind was anything but still. He knew how fragile narratives became when handled by the wrong hands. And Marek, with his wounded pride, was already rewriting history in his favor. Kalen's fingers moved quietly beneath the tray table. He tapped twice on the side of his sleek titanium watch, an unassuming device that now vibrated once to confirm. Audio recording active. From that moment forward, every word, every shuffle, every accusation would be preserved. He didn't plan to need it, but like all strategic minds, Kalen prepared for contingencies long before they arrived. Back in the galley, Marek leaned in close to another flight attendant. "Torin," he hissed, trying to keep his voice low but sharp enough to cut. "I need a witness. Passenger in 2A just assaulted me, unprovoked." Torin Vale, a tall, wiry man in his mid-30s with neatly parted hair and a deep sense of procedural loyalty, looked stunned. He had only seen the aftermath, not the spark. But Marek's tone carried urgency, conviction, and a note of fear that manipulated Torin's instincts. He stepped back slightly. "Wait, what happened?" Torin asked cautiously, scanning toward the front of the cabin. "He grabbed my arm and twisted it when I tried to adjust his seat," Marek said, layering the lie with theatrical restraint. "He's aggressive. I'm filing it under Protocol 7, escalated passenger aggression." Torin blinked. Protocol 7 was serious. Normally, it required multiple crew confirmations, but Marek was invoking it solo. "And he said something threatening," Marek added quickly, voice lower. "Didn't get it all, but it was enough." Kalen, still seated, could not hear their conversation, but he could see their postures, one man animated, the other cautious. He knew what was coming before it began. His mind raced through scenarios, recalling federal aviation policy and passenger rights. His instincts told him, document, stay calm, and never move first. Moments later, both men returned to the cabin, walking side by side, a wall of feigned professionalism. Torin's face was composed, but his eyes darted toward Kalen with a flicker of uncertainty. Marek, on the other hand, wore a calm mask stretched too tightly over barely contained rage. "Sir," Torin began, voice carefully even. To avoid further disruption, We're going to ask if you'd be willing to relocate to another seat. Kalen looked at him, not with hostility but clarity. Have I done anything wrong? He asked, his voice quiet, even, but loaded with precision. Torin hesitated. We're just trying to de-escalate. I understand, Kalen cut in gently, but unless I've broken a policy, I have no obligation to move from the seat I was assigned. A pause stretched between them. The air was thinner now. Passengers nearby had stopped pretending to ignore the situation. Heads tilted. Eyes peeked over seats. The tension had substance, heavy and growing. Torin glanced at Marek, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. Go ahead. With hesitation tightening his brow, Torin reached toward Kalen's arm. Kalen didn't flinch. Instead, he raised one hand slowly, palm forward. I wouldn't do that, he said. Not with threat but with unmistakable warning. Torin froze mid-gesture. The silence in the cabin became deafening. Something in Kalen's voice carried weight. Not aggression, but presence. Torin stepped back, arm at his side, unsure of what to do next. His authority had stalled. And then the intercom crackled. A short, clipped burst of static gave way to a strange phrase that seemed to echo with meaning despite its obscurity. Cabin alert, standby for our shift protocol. Only 3 people on board understood what it meant, and 2 of them were now standing in front of Kalen. Marek's spine straightened. Torin's eyes widened. The words had struck like lightning, silent to most, but deafening to those who knew what they carried. Torin's voice dropped to a whisper. Did they just say, our shift? Marek muttered, cutting him off. His jaw tightened. They never used that unless... Kalen watched them both. Their sudden change in posture, their nervous glances, something had changed. Something larger than ego or embarrassment. What's our shift? Kalen asked calmly. Neither of them answered. In that moment, Kalen understood 2 things. First, that the confrontation wasn't just personal, it was now part of something hidden. And second, that the recording on his wrist had just become the most valuable object on the plane. He leaned back slightly, still calm, still watching. The game had shifted. The crew no longer moved with confidence but with caution, shadows trailing their thoughts. Whatever our shift was, it had rattled them more than any passenger could. That single cryptic message was the moment everything changed. Our shift protocol active. The words crackled through the intercom like static-laced thunder, short, clipped, and emotionless. But the reaction it sparked was anything but. Marek Dolan's spine visibly stiffened, the blood draining from his face so rapidly it looked like someone had flipped a switch inside him. Torin Vale, the junior attendant beside him, froze mid-step. His fingers curled awkwardly around the seatback in row 2, knuckles whitening with tension. Their posture, once rigid with smug authority, collapsed into something shaken, confused, afraid. Kalen Reimer didn't blink. He had been watching both men with the analytical patience of someone trained to decode tension. Now, that calm observation sharpened into calculated alertness. The shift was unmistakable. Whatever that phrase meant, it had power and not the kind passengers were meant to hear. He leaned slightly forward, keeping his body relaxed but his mind alert. His watch, now set to record, picked up the subtle rise in Marek's breathing as he turned sharply and hissed into Torin's ear. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not this flight. Torin glanced sideways, the sheen of sweat breaking on his brow betraying his composed facade. We need to follow the sequence, he whispered, voice brittle. Kalen caught every word. The tension in the cabin turned electric. Passengers stirred, whispering nervously, their expressions flickering between curiosity and unease. Kalen stayed still, sensing that something had just shifted beneath the surface, something larger than a belligerent crew member. A system, protocol, a hidden hand. Marek stepped back toward Kalen's row, his eyes darting toward row 3, then snapping back like a rubber band. His voice trembled with a forced authority. Sir, I'm going to need you to comply with additional seat check procedures. Kalen didn't move. His voice was level. You've already scanned my boarding pass. Twice. This is about flight protocol, Not tickets, Marek snapped, louder than necessary. I'm asking you. No. Kalen cut in smoothly, never raising his voice. You're provoking, and it's being recorded. Marek's face twitched. The pale hue beneath his skin deepened to something redder. The digital eye of Kalen's watch blinked silently. He had him. The recordings, the aggression, the lies. He had all of it. From across the aisle, a soft voice rose like a match struck in the dark. I saw everything. Heads turned. A man in his late 30s stood slowly, tall, lean, with thick glasses and an accountant's unassuming presence. Aaron Vallis. He had been quiet the entire flight, reading a thin paperback and sipping mint tea. Now his calm voice carried weight. He didn't provoke anything, Aaron continued. That attendant did. Twice. I'll testify if needed. Marek turned on him with a look that could peel paint. Sit down. This doesn't concern you. It does now, Aaron replied, lifting his phone, the screen still glowing. I recorded it too. A gasp rippled through the cabin. Somewhere, a phone camera clicked to life. Another screen lit up. Another. A chain reaction. Kalen didn't move, but inside, his pulse rose, steady but firm. Witnesses. Evidence. Leverage. Torin looked like he was about to speak, but Marek turned on him suddenly. You stay out of this, he barked. He matches the flag. Kalen's gaze sharpened. That phrase again. The flag. What flag? Kalen asked quietly, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. Marek didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the cockpit, his jaw working like he was chewing something bitter. I need access to the panel, he muttered. Torin grabbed his arm. Not with R-shift active, he hissed. Every movement is tracked now. Marek yanked free. I'm not losing my career because of a protocol glitch. Kalen stood now, not aggressive, not loud, just composed and unmovable. His voice cut through the rising noise. You're unraveling, in front of everyone. Marek's hands trembled. You weren't supposed to. You weren't. His words broke off. He turned, storming toward the galley, his steps uneven. Torin looked like he wanted to vanish. His eyes found Kalen's. For a brief second, something passed between them. Shame, perhaps, or fear. Kalen remained standing, steady, his watch blinking red. He glanced around the cabin. Every passenger was watching now. Not him. Not Marek. The truth. The aisle had become a front line. Every inch between seats was a fault line. Trust, shattered. Authority questioned. But Kalen wasn't finished. Not yet. He walked one slow step toward row 3, scanning the seat numbers. Who else was flagged? And why? Behind him, Aaron spoke again. Louder this time. Firm. I'm saving all footage to cloud backup. In case anything disappears. Kalen allowed himself a single breath. Then he sat back down, folding his hands calmly over his briefcase. Even as the overhead lights flickered from turbulence, the aircraft shook. But the real storm was already in the cabin. The truth was beginning to gain its own weight, becoming too heavy for Marek to bury. A loud jolt of turbulence rocked the cabin, jolting trays, water cups, and nerves all at once. Passengers clutched their armrests instinctively, but the true instability wasn't in the skies. It was in the galley, where Marek Dolan was unraveling fast. He shoved past Torin Vale without a word, eyes darting wildly, hands shaking as he dropped to one knee before the sealed compartment beneath the galley's main console. His breath came shallow and rapid. Sweat dotted his temple despite the air-conditioned chill, and his fingers fumbled over the recessed latches that were supposed to remain untouched mid-flight. Marek, what are you doing? Torin hissed behind him, voice taut with alarm. Marek didn't answer. He yanked open a maintenance pouch, dug around, and pulled free a utility key he wasn't authorized to use. His hands trembled as he jammed it into the lock with unnecessary force. Torin stepped forward, lowering his voice. You know the R-shift protocol is active. Every move we make is recorded now. This isn't just career-ending, this is federal. Marek snapped his head up, eyes bloodshot. I'm not losing everything over some passenger with a briefcase and a smug face, he growled. I've worked 10 years on this route. One screw up and they sideline me. I won't let this be the end. From row 2A, Kalen Reimer sat frozen, his gaze narrowing as he watched Marek's desperate movements unfold through the thin galley curtain. He leaned forward slightly. From this angle, he couldn't see the compartment, but he could hear the metallic clicks, the scraping sounds, the tension thickening with every second. His mind was racing, pulling together fragments, Marek's comment about protocol overrides, the coded intercom message, the deliberate provocations, the mention of being flagged. Something systemic was hiding behind all this, and Marek was on the edge of revealing it by force. A sharp clang snapped Kalen's attention back to the galley. The sealed panel sprang open with a metallic pop, echoing louder than it should have. Gasps erupted from nearby passengers. Even Torin stepped back, his voice dropping to a shaken whisper. That's the crew reset log, he breathed. Level 3. Marek, if you touch that, it sends an alert straight to ground security. Marek didn't care. His expression twisted into something desperate, part fury, part panic, as he reached for the compact slate-like device inside the compartment. It glowed faintly, labeled in bold. Crew reset log, level 3. Tamper alert, active. I didn't start this, he snapped. He made me escalate. He forced this. All I wanted was compliance, just one clean protocol run. Now everything's ruined. Torin reached out to grab his shoulder. This isn't about the protocol anymore. This is about sanity. Marek shoved him back violently. Torin hit the side of the galley wall with a grunt and stumbled sideways, clutching his elbow. The cabin saw it happen. All illusions of professionalism were gone. Marek stormed out of the galley, unhinged and breathing hard. His target was clear. Kalen stood slowly, calmly, his body angled in a defensive stance even though his hands remained open at his sides. Don't come closer, Kalen warned evenly, eyes locked on Marek's every twitch. You ruined everything, Marek snarled through clenched teeth. He lifted his elbow again, repeating the very gesture that had started the unraveling, this time not as a test of compliance, but an act of chaos. Kalen didn't flinch. He waited, timing the approach with machine-like clarity. Marek lunged. Kalen moved. It was subtle, almost elegant. He pivoted his left foot backward just enough to create space, letting Marek's momentum carry him too far forward. At the last second, Kalen rotated his upper body and raised his right arm, not to strike, but to redirect. He caught Marek's elbow again, only this time, instead of bending it, he let the motion pass clean over his shoulder. Marek lost his footing and crashed shoulder first into the beverage cart, sending bottles rattling and plastic tumblers scattering like dice. The sound ricocheted through the cabin. A woman in row 4 gasped. Someone else shouted, "He's lost control." Kalen didn't move to restrain Marek. He didn't need to. The cabin itself had become the witness. From the back row, Aaron Vallis, still gripping his phone, stood up and pointed it directly at the chaos. "I'm filming everything," he said loudly, his voice shaky but firm. "This is going straight to ground control." Marek sat hunched near the cart, chest heaving, eyes wide with disbelief. He turned toward Torin, who now stood by the cockpit door, unsure whether to radio in or hold the line. Torin's hand trembled on the console, caught between duty and fear. Kalen stepped back to his seat and slowly sat down, exhaling through his nose. His expression was unreadable, part fatigue, part calculation. Inside, his objective had crystallized. This wasn't just about protecting himself anymore. It was about exposing what gave Marek the audacity to go this far in the first place. Torin whispered something into his headset, pale-faced. Marek curled into himself on the floor, muttering incoherently, repeating the same line under his breath. "I didn't fail the program. It failed me. I didn't fail." The flight was no longer just about passengers and altitude. It had become a crucible for truth. Truth caught in phones, in eyes, in restraint, in rage. The cabin had transformed into a space where truth and deception battled for every inch. Marek lunged. The second attack was messier than the first. His posture unhinged, breath loud, steps erratic. His arms swung in a wide, uncontrolled arc, aimed squarely for Kalen's ribs again. But Kalen didn't flinch. He shifted just slightly, weight balanced on the balls of his feet, and sidestepped with a precision that looked instinctive. The blow missed by inches. Marek's momentum betrayed him, sending him stumbling into the aisle. Kalen didn't retaliate. His hands remained open, visible, steady. Passengers gasped, startled not just by the aggression but by the restraint. Marek spun around, red-faced and panting, and the cabin, once filled with idle travel murmurs, now pulsed with a growing sense of dread. He's trying to provoke me, Kalen thought, but not out of impulse. He's following something. Torrin Vale, still standing near the forward galley, raised both hands, voice shaking. Marek, that's enough. You're going too far. But Marek's eyes were locked on Kalen, wild and unfocused. He's flagged, he shouted, voice cracking. The protocol never should have selected him. He wasn't supposed to fight back. Passengers exchanged confused glances. Flagged. Kalen's mind repeated the word, and suddenly it became more than just noise. It was a puzzle piece, jagged and out of place. Stop, Torrin urged again, moving closer. You're breaking every boundary we were given. Marek didn't hear him or didn't care. He lunged again, this time with both arms outstretched in a desperate tackle. Kalen sidestepped once more, gently redirecting Marek's momentum. The flight attendant's body twisted as Kalen guided him sideways with minimal force, and he slammed shoulder first into the galley counter. A sharp metallic thud echoed down the cabin. Someone screamed. A drink cart toppled in the rear galley. Kalen exhaled slowly, trying to calm his own adrenaline. His ribs still throbbed from the earlier jab, but his focus was sharper than ever. The cockpit intercom buzzed, crackling with urgency. Crew, confirm status. The captain's voice demanded. Torrin turned to respond, but Marek, staggering upright, grabbed the handset first. He's dangerous, Marek yelled into the mouthpiece. He's attacking crew. You need to. Kalen stepped forward, not rushing, not aggressive, but firm. His voice cut through the rising chaos like a blade. We have video evidence, he said clearly, making sure every word rang loud and crisp. Your crew member has assaulted a passenger. Silence followed for a second that stretched far too long. Aaron Vallis, the accountant in 5B, stood with his phone raised. It's true. I've been recording since the first contact. His voice didn't tremble this time. Others have footage too. Around the cabin, phones began to rise, silent testaments against Marek's false narrative. A woman across the aisle nodded, her eyes locked on Marek. A businessman near the bulkhead mouthed, I saw it all. Marek froze. Kalen watched his enemy's face shift, anger curdling into fear, then disbelief, then something else. He wasn't just losing control. He was realizing he never had it. Torrin stepped forward, swallowing hard, and pressed the intercom button himself. Captain, he said slowly, his voice ragged but steady. Passenger is not the threat. Our crew member is. And with that, the dam burst. Murmurs swelled into full voices. A wave of righteous anger surged through the cabin as people began to speak up. Not yelling, but firm, measured, like a truth that had been stifled too long finally taking its first breath. Kalen said nothing more. He didn't need to. He simply stepped back, exhaled, and returned to his seat, his body still poised, his mind still scanning. The captain didn't respond immediately, but the shift was clear. This was no longer about a misunderstanding. It was about accountability. As Marek stood frozen, his hands trembling and breath shallow, Kalen glanced once toward the front of the cabin. The moment had passed, but its consequences were only just beginning. The truth was out, but the consequences had just begun to unfold. He pressed harder, confident in control, unaware that every movement had already been anticipated. and the CEO's counter would leave him incapacitated before he could react. If you believe abuse under a uniform always collapses under precision and skill, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The captain's voice came through the intercom with sterile calm. Due to a crew malfunction, we will begin an immediate priority landing sequence. Please remain seated. The words had a strange weight. Crew malfunction, clinical, cold, and far too vague for what had just happened in the cabin. The seatbelt signs blinked on with a mechanical chime, and a ripple of alarm passed through the passengers. Kalen Reimer did not move. His back remained straight, posture composed, eyes sharp. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as emergency protocols engaged, casting an eerie orange glow along the aisle. The engines shifted pitch as the aircraft banked gently, descending through a cloud layer. Kalen's mind moved faster than the plane, connecting threads, watching everything. Across from him, Marek Dolan sat hunched on the edge of the jump seat, his breathing rapid and shallow. The same man who had jabbed him in the ribs, spilled water on his data, and lied about protocol now looked smaller. But danger never needed height. Kalen knew that, especially when desperation settled in a man's bones. Torin Vale, the second attendant, stood between them like a brittle barrier, his hands visibly shaking. "Just don't move, Marek," Torin whispered, his voice dry and strained. But Marek wasn't listening. He leaned forward, slowly, like a man who had just seen the edge of his career, and maybe his sanity. "They're going to pin all this on me," he muttered, eyes darting like a cornered animal. "Everything. I followed orders." Kalen didn't respond. His instinct told him to let Marek talk. Let the cracks show. Marek's voice lowered, trembling yet oddly measured. "You think I wanted to go after you?" he said, inching forward again. "I was given instructions, all right? Ground Ops flagged your seat weeks ago. Said you were part of a compliance sweep. A test." Kalen's jaw stiffened. The words felt surreal. "A test?" he asked, the calm in his voice deceptive. Marek nodded, eyes flicking to the other passengers. Most were still watching cautiously, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. "They told me, people like you," he whispered, "they don't fight back. You were never supposed to fight back." Kalen's breath slowed. He understood now. He hadn't just been targeted, he'd been selected. Selected, not for his race, not for his seat, for his personality, his restraint, his predictability. Torin blinked in disbelief. "You said it was personal," he said quietly. Marek shook his head. "No. It was assigned. They said pick the calm ones. The ones who wouldn't make a scene. They wanted to study how much pressure someone like him could take before reacting." Kalen felt his hands tighten around the armrest, not out of fear, but out of understanding. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was institutional, engineered. He had walked onto this flight thinking it was a simple business trip. In truth, he had boarded an experiment. A loud metallic click shook the cabin, landing gear deploying. The plane shook, a sudden jolt throwing a beverage cup to the floor. Marek flinched. Torin instinctively stepped closer to Kalen, protective now, not adversarial. Marek's face crumpled. "I'm finished," he whispered. Then, his expression shifted again, his panic freezing over into something calculated, detached. Kalen stood slowly, eyes never leaving Marek's. "You need to sit down." For a moment, Marek didn't move. His lips parted, as though he wanted to confess more. But then the moment passed, and Torin gently but firmly took him by the shoulder and directed him toward the crew jump seat. He buckled him in, double-checking the harness as if restraining something more volatile than a man, perhaps a system unraveling. Kalen remained standing a second longer, scanning the cabin. Every passenger was watching now. Some looked confused, others scared, but many looked angry, no longer at Kalen, but at what had been done to him. He returned to his seat and buckled in, his mind no longer on the landing, but on the deeper war that had just been exposed. The captain's voice returned, "Prepare for final descent." Kalen's thoughts churned, not about revenge, but about exposure. This couldn't end at touchdown. It had to go further. As the runway lights appeared through the window and the cabin braced for landing, Kalen replayed Marek's whisper over and over. "You were never supposed to fight back." He exhaled slowly. The conflict had grown far beyond an elbow jab. It was now entangled with a secret program Kalen never knew existed. The descent was not just toward the runway but toward a truth no one expected. The wheels struck the runway with a thunderous jolt, metal shuddering beneath the cabin as the aircraft lunged forward, brakes groaning in defiance of its momentum. Passengers jolted in their seats, some gasping, others gripping armrests. But Kalen Reimer barely flinched. His eyes weren't on the seatbelt sign or the forward cabin. They were locked on the window, out beyond the glass. Through the blur of jet fumes and terminal lights, a strange perimeter was forming. Uniformed figures moved with quiet precision. Not the usual baggage crews or runway escorts. These men wore dark tactical jackets emblazoned with an insignia Kalen hadn't seen in years: Operations Verification Division. OVD. Internal Compliance Agents. Their presence at a commercial arrival gate was not just rare, it was unheard of. He narrowed his eyes. 4 of them, then 6. One adjusted a comms device, scanning a terminal manifest. Another held a biometric scanner close to his chest. Kalen counted 8 before the jet bridge aligned. None of them looked toward the passengers. Not even once. Their focus was singular, precise, intentional. Inside the cabin, a murmur rose. A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances. One whispered, "Why are there so many officers?" Another reached for their phone. But the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been advised of a crew-level malfunction that requires immediate documentation. Please remain seated while ground personnel assist." But Kalen knew. This wasn't about Marek Dolan alone. The door opened with a hiss. Cold air swept into the front galley as a tall officer stepped in. Darren Volst. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, military poise. His eyes scanned the cabin only once before landing directly on Kalen. He didn't blink, didn't address the other passengers, didn't ask for crew input. He simply said, "Dr. Kalen Reimer, I need you to come with me for incident clarification." Kalen held his gaze, unmoved. The phrasing was deliberate: clarification, not interview, not assistance. A word chosen to disarm, to imply cooperation while disguising scrutiny. He rose slowly, securing his briefcase without a word. Before he could step into the aisle, a voice cut through the tension. "I have full video footage of what happened," said Aaron Vallis, the quiet accountant from 2 rows back. His voice trembled slightly, but his hand was steady as he held up his phone. "I recorded the elbow assault, the threat, everything." All heads turned. Marek's face flushed crimson from the jump seat, where Torin Vale now sat guard. Another passenger, a younger man in a gray jacket, lifted his phone too. "Me too. I got the part where he tried to tamper with the flight log." Others murmured in agreement, holding up devices like protest signs in a silent courtroom. Darren's brow tightened. His hand hovered near his waist, not in threat, but as if reaching for a different script than the one he'd been handed. He hadn't expected resistance. Not this kind. Not this fast. From his radio, a sharp crackle interrupted the moment. "Protocol breach confirmed," a voice said flatly. "Proceed with Tier 2 review." Darren froze. Kalen turned to him, voice low but cutting. "What does Tier 2 mean?" The officer's eyes flickered with something between hesitation and restraint. He didn't answer. Torin Vale stood abruptly, his own nerves betraying his motion. "I'll testify," he said. "I saw what happened. I think I understand now." He wasn't just angry. Something else was going on. "I should have stopped it sooner." Marek shouted from behind. "He's lying. I followed instructions. I did what I was told." But no one moved to support him. The cabin had turned. The momentum had shifted. Darren exhaled slowly and gave a subtle nod to 2 officers at the door. They moved toward Marek, securing his wrists with a practiced swiftness. Marek thrashed once, then slumped back, muttering under his breath about orders, flags, and failures. Kalen stepped into the aisle, his pace calm, his expression unreadable. As he passed Aaron, he offered a small, grateful nod. Aaron returned it silently, gripping his phone tighter. When Kalen reached the galley, Darren gestured toward the jet bridge. This way. But Kalen paused. I'll cooperate, he said firmly. But I won't allow the story to be rewritten. Not by you. Not by anyone. Darren didn't argue. Instead, he simply walked. Kalen followed, the sterile white of the jet bridge surrounding him, every step echoing with memory and momentum. Behind him, the cabin slowly began to exhale, but not with peace, only with the knowledge that something bigger had arrived on that runway. Kalen's mind sharpened. His objective was no longer just about Marek's aggression. It was about the system that enabled it, the silence that protected it. The tag on the officer's chest was more than fabric. It was a clue, a map to a truth buried deeper than anyone had guessed. As the hallway narrowed and the doors ahead parted, Kalen didn't feel fear. He felt purpose. He didn't know what Tier 2 meant yet, but he would. The truth was no longer a secret. It was a force pushing its way into the light. The moment the door latched shut behind him, Colin knew this wasn't a standard debriefing. The investigation room was cold, metallic, and suffocatingly sterile. Walls the color of fog, light panels that hummed with artificial clarity, and a long steel table bolted to the floor as if expecting confrontation. No windows, no clock, just control. Colin stood still for a beat, reading the room before walking to the center and setting his watch gently on the table, face up. This contains audio and time-stamped recordings of the entire incident, he said, his voice even, measured, and stripped of any trace of fear. Across from him sat Officer Darren Volst, his posture rigid and his fingers pressed into a clipboard as though willing it to stay shut. Two more officers flanked the walls silently, enforcers, not interviewers. But Colin's presence, though calm, took up all the space. Not because he tried to, but because he didn't flinch. Darren tapped his pen twice before finally looking up. We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Reimer. This is purely procedural. No, Colin interrupted, his tone firm but devoid of disrespect. This isn't procedural. It's evasive. I'm asking once, clearly and directly. Why was my seat flagged? Silence dropped like a stone in water. Darren shifted uncomfortably, his lips pressing into a line. He scribbled something that looked like a stall tactic. Then the unexpected happened. One of the wall officers, younger, leaner, and clearly less practiced in protocol, stepped forward. His name badge read J. Dane. His eyes flicked toward Darren, then back to Colin. I think he deserves the truth, Jorel Dane said, his voice low but steady. Darren snapped toward him. Officer Dane, that's not your call. I know it's not, but the truth's already circling. You saw the passenger phones. You know what's coming. Darren's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. Jorel turned to Colin and exhaled as if releasing a burden. Your seat, 3A, was selected under a program called Passenger Resilience Calibration. Internal only. Confidential. It was supposed to test how passengers respond to controlled stress scenarios delivered by crew under observation. Colin didn't blink. You're telling me this was a study? A test, Jorel corrected. You weren't supposed to know. The goal was to assess behavioral thresholds, patience, verbal escalation, complaint patterns. Colin sat back slightly, absorbing the blow. It felt like glass had cracked under his feet, and now he was looking down at the design beneath it. His eyes narrowed. So I was baited, chosen to be mistreated. And no one thought consent mattered. Jorel looked away. Consent wasn't part of the calibration model. Only debriefing if escalation occurred. And the elbow? Colin asked sharply. Was that part of your model too? Jorel hesitated. No. That wasn't in the script. Physical contact is a breach. The idea was to stay within psychological stress triggers. Marek Dolan, he went off script. Darren finally broke his silence, voice taut. That's enough, Dane. But Jorel stood his ground. They deserve to know, sir. He wasn't a random target. He was profiled, calm, professional, statistically low likelihood of violence, but high likelihood of reporting. That's what they looked for. Colin's stomach turned, not from the insult, but from the mechanism behind it. He was picked because they thought he'd take it and report it cleanly, giving them perfect data. "How many others?" he asked quietly. Jor-El said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. Foreshadowing hung in the air like static. Colin could feel it. This wasn't an isolated experiment. It was systemic, and its roots were deep. "You realize what you're admitting?" Colin asked, voice rising slightly but still composed. "This isn't just unethical. It's a violation of basic psychological consent, not to mention Federal Aviation Trust standards." Darren, now pale and tight-jawed, leaned forward. "Mr. Reimer, I advise we continue through the proper channels. Your statements are being recorded." "And so were yours," Colin cut in, pointing at the watch on the table. "From the moment Marek laid hands on me to now." Darren's gaze faltered. Jor-El exhaled again, whispering, "There are at least 3 videos from other passengers, plus the audio. This is going public whether we document it or not." The room tightened like a fist. The officers flanking the walls shifted uncomfortably, realizing the hierarchy was unraveling in real time. Colin stood. His figure was framed by the harsh fluorescent glow from above, casting sharp shadows beneath his chin, as if sculpted from resolve itself. "I'm not asking any more," he said, voice calm and authoritative. "I'm stating. I want every part of what happened logged, signed, and submitted into official records. Not redacted, not interpreted, documented." Darren looked up at him, the weight of the situation crashing into his expression like a tide he couldn't hold back. A long pause stretched, then a slow nod. One officer moved toward the console. The other opened a form screen. The balance had shifted again. Colin didn't move until they began typing. Then and only then did he return to his seat, folding his hands. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about everyone who'd been chosen because they were expected to endure. The investigation had begun, but its direction now belonged to Colin. The investigation room was already humming with tension when the metal door swung open and Marek Dolan was let in, wrists shackled in front of him. His uniform was wrinkled, one sleeve torn near the cuff, and his face burned with a mix of defiance and disbelief. He stumbled slightly as he was brought to the far end of the room, but recovered with a venomous glare. "I only followed instructions," he shouted, voice echoing off the steel walls, defiance dripping from every word. The officers didn't respond. They'd heard variations of that line too many times today. Kalen Reimer sat still in the center of the long metal table, surrounded by scattered documents, blinking monitors, and half-drunk coffee cups. His expression was composed, but his mind raced. He had already given a clear, moment-by-moment breakdown of every event, from the first aggressive shoulder bump to the coded intercom message to Marek's desperate lunge in the aisle. Now, he was watching the man who set it all in motion fall apart under the weight of exposure. The investigators, seated around the table and behind terminals, had begun comparing testimonies, syncing footage, and whispering terms like Tier 2 violation and unauthorized flag escalation. Torrin Vale entered quietly behind Marek. He wasn't in cuffs, but he looked pale and unsure. He held a small tablet in both hands and avoided eye contact with anyone. When called to speak, his voice trembled. I didn't know what the flags meant. I thought it was protocol. Marek told me it was routine." He swallowed hard, glancing at Kalen. "But he was acting strange even before the flight. I thought he just wanted to prove himself." Darren Volst crossed his arms, brow furrowed. "You said you overheard something on the ground. Something about why passengers were flagged." Torrin hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. Someone from ground ops during pre-boarding. They said Row 3 was part of the soft resistance cohort. I didn't get it at first, but then I heard them laugh. They said those are the ones least likely to fight back but most likely to file reports, people who would document everything but not cause a scene." Kalen leaned forward slightly, The phrase stung with truth. Calm, controlled, educated. He was targeted precisely because he fit their mold of the ideal stress subject. The irony twisted in his chest. They'd mistaken his restraint for vulnerability. A calculated error. Darren's jaw tightened. So you're telling us passengers were selected for behavioral experimentation? Torin looked down. Yes, that's what it sounded like. They even said they wanted to calibrate the limits. Measure thresholds without risk, I think was the phrase. Across the table, Jorel Dane, one of the junior investigators, clicked rapidly through video stills. This matches what we saw on Reimer's watch recordings. Consistent provocation, increasingly physical. And then the device in the galley. Marek tried to reset the crew log. Darren shot a look at Marek. And you still want us to believe this was just about a seat dispute? Marek didn't answer. His confidence was unraveling. His shoulders sagged just slightly. Then came the twist that shifted the entire room. Jorel pulled up an audio transcript. This is the cockpit to crew message, right before the attempted reset. The R-shift protocol warning. Everyone turned toward the screen as the clipped message played. R-shift protocol active. Crew position log under Tier 2 review. Notify ground oversight. Timestamp 039er. Darren blinked. Wait, so the R-shift wasn't about Kalen. It wasn't a signal to escalate. Jorel nodded. It was a containment alert. It means the test had breached limits. Marek wasn't supposed to go that far. Kalen felt a chill run through him. For a moment, he had believed the system was built purely to provoke passengers. Now he understood it was worse. It was designed to manipulate, and then silently correct its own failures before anyone could see. But they hadn't counted on someone resisting calmly and recording everything. He glanced at Marek. The man was staring blankly now, no longer shouting, no longer defiant. He had crossed a line that even the system's architects had warned against. And now that line had pulled the whole structure down with it. Kalen turned to Darren. You knew this would collapse the moment outside eyes saw it. That's why you didn't arrest me. You hoped it could be contained. Darren's silence was answer enough. The room settled into a slow, thick silence. Evidence piled like waves on the table. Screen after screen displayed moments of assault, resistance, orders, hesitation. Torin slumped into a chair, shaking his head. I didn't know it would go this far. Kalen didn't respond. He was already looking past this room, toward the tribunal, toward the press hall, toward the people who needed to understand that this wasn't just a mistake. It was a system designed to break boundaries quietly, and he had become the first to expose it. The truth had layers, and each one revealed a deeper failure behind the program. The video freezes mid-frame. The room falls silent. Kalen's arm is mid-motion on the screen, his hand gripping Marek's elbow with surgical precision, firm, but controlled. The exact moment of impact halts on the wall-sized monitor, showing Marek's twisted posture and Kalen's calm restraint. No one speaks. No one breathes. The executives sitting around the long glass conference table shift uneasily in their chairs. Across from them, Kalen stands tall, his expression unreadable but resolute. He does not flinch under the scrutiny. His hands are clasped behind his back, and his voice remains even when he finally breaks the silence. That was the moment your employee assaulted me, he says. And that, he gestures to the frozen image, is the moment I chose not to strike back. The lead executive, a pale, tight-lipped man named Harvin Silst, adjusts his collar. We're still reviewing the context, Dr. Reimer. The context, Kalen interrupts, eyes narrowed but steady, is that your protocol authorized a known unstable crew member to provoke passengers as part of a behavioral test. The investigators seated beside the executives nod grimly. One of them, Investigator Calendros, types swiftly on his tablet, eyes darting back and forth between Kalen and the video playback. Torin Vale, standing just off to the side, clears his throat. His voice shakes, but he speaks anyway. I confirm what Dr. Reimer said. Marek told me to lie, said we had to override protocol clarity. I didn't understand it at the time, but I do now. Another executive murmurs something under his breath. Kalen hears it but doesn't react. Investigator Dross lifts a hand. We've just pulled the staff logs. Marek Dolan was internally flagged 3 weeks ago as unfit for controlled testing. The warning came from his direct shift lead. It was overridden. All heads turn toward the monitor again as a second screen comes alive, displaying internal memos. One message is highlighted in red. Override accepted. Data threshold for cycle not met. Proceed with field flagging. Ops Supervisor Karan Vale. Desperate to hit data quotas. Kalen murmurs. You gambled with passenger safety. No one was harmed. One executive attempts, his tone defensive. Kalen's eyes snap to him. The only reason no one was harmed is because I refused to be baited. Torin's knuckles whiten as he grips the side of the table. Marek wasn't supposed to go that far, but he did. He elbowed Dr. Reimer in the ribs. Twice. He tried to fake log entries. He tried to erase the cabin log. I stopped him once, but I should have done more. Kalen softens for the briefest moment. You stepped forward. That matters. Across the table, another investigator, Jorel Dane, leans forward, voice steady but heavy with concern. The passenger resilience calibration protocol operates under the assumption that a passive, high-composure individual will provide optimal behavioral data under stress. But this crossed into assault. And not for the first time. Whispers rise around the room. How many other incidents were buried? Kalen asks. Dross nods solemnly. We've uncovered 4 other internal cases linked to PRC. All were settled quietly. All involved passengers who were profiled for calmness and discretion. A bead of sweat runs down Harvin Silst's temple. Kalen steps forward, voice clear. You targeted me not because I was a threat, but because I wouldn't fight back. Because I look like someone who will stay calm no matter what's done to him. That's the profile you built your program around. Silence. Until Dross speaks again, this time holding up a regulation manual. According to FAA Civil Code 241.4b, no passenger, regardless of behavior, is to be enrolled in observational testing without written and fully informed consent. What happened on Flight 882 violates this standard. It violates psychological ethics, and it violates common decency. One executive stands up abruptly, clearly rattled. We were misled. The system wasn't designed to escalate like this. But it did, Dross says coldly. And this isn't about design. It's about execution. Suddenly the door opens and a junior investigator steps in, whispering into Dross's ear. Dross frowns, then turns to the room. Just confirmed. The footage from 6 different passengers on Flight 882 has gone viral. It's on 4 major networks already. You won't be able to contain this. The words land like a hammer. Every executive in the room stiffens. Jorel speaks again. Quieter now. It's over. Whether you shut it down or not, the public will. Kalen doesn't move. He lets the silence do the work. Finally, Dross leans back in his chair, eyes fixed on the image still frozen on the screen. This tribunal finds that the passenger resilience calibration protocol directly endangers passengers, violates multiple ethical codes, and has no place in this airline or any other. He turns to Kalen. Dr. Reimer, what is it you want now? Kalen exhales slowly. I don't want revenge. I want reform. I want a standard that prevents this from happening again, to anyone. Harvin Silst stares at him, hollow-eyed, knowing there is no path forward without compliance. We'll cooperate. Kalen nods once, then turns toward the door. Behind him, the screen goes dark, and as the tribunal prepares for the storm ahead, one final truth settles quietly in the air, undeniable, irreversible. The tribunal had become the turning point where silence could no longer protect misconduct. The microphone clicked once, and then silence. Kalen Reimer stood center stage in the gleaming Vensford Press Hall. His reflection doubled in the marble backdrop behind him. Rows of journalists, industry analysts, and aviation regulators filled every seat. Cameras rolled. Pens scratched. The atmosphere carried a brittle tension, one not born of hostility, but reverence. They weren't here for a press update. They were here for a reckoning. The investigation has concluded. Kalen began, his voice clear, even, and rooted with a strength that had grown sharper through adversity. And today, I stand not to condemn a man, but to illuminate a system. Behind him, screens displayed the title of the newly ratified regulation, the Reimer Passenger Integrity Standard, a law born from the elbow jab of a single flight attendant, now inscribed into the architecture of national aviation reform. The irony was not lost on Kalen. He had boarded Skylumen Flight 882 with confidential software in his briefcase, never realizing the true payload he carried was himself. A flicker in the second row caught his eye. Torin Vale, in a tailored gray suit, nodded with quiet encouragement. Once a frightened flight attendant caught in the shadow of corrupted protocol, Torin now stood as a safety analyst for the Federal Flight Oversight Council. His promotion was more than merit, it was redemption. Torin had testified when it counted. Had hesitated, yes, but had ultimately chosen truth over compliance. Kalen gave him the faintest nod back. Reporters shifted. Microphones hovered. Kalen continued, "The program known as Passenger Resilience Calibration has been officially dismantled. Its intent to test emotional thresholds in flight may have been cloaked in research language, but its execution was built on silence, manipulation, and harm. Every word hung in the room with clinical precision. The audience wasn't just hearing a report. They were witnessing a eulogy for institutional abuse. Near the left wing of the room, Aaron Vallis sat stiffly in a reserved seat. The man who had first stood mid-flight to declare the truth was now being honored for it. His phone, which had recorded the moment Marek Dolan drove his elbow into Kalen's side, had become a pillar of evidence no executive could erase. And speaking of Marek, Kalen's gaze lingered on the final seat in the front row. Empty. Symbolic. The airline had not invited him. But the tribunal had rendered its verdict. Marek faced formal charges for assault, tampering with operational logs, and violating aviation conduct laws. Yet Kalen had requested that one sentence remain untouched: mandatory psychological rehabilitation. Not as leniency, but as accountability. During the tribunal, it was revealed that Marek had been coerced by his direct supervisor to push the envelope on threshold provocation. Under threat of demotion, he had become both a weapon and a casualty of the system. Kalen paused, letting silence speak its own testimony. The tension broke as a journalist called out, "Dr. Reimer, what comes next?" He turned, face calm, but eyes resolute. "Next, we build. Not just regulation, but culture. We create a safety foundation rooted in ethics, transparency, and respect. One where passengers aren't data points, where restraint isn't exploited, and where accountability doesn't wait until someone breaks." As cameras flashed and murmurs echoed, Kalen stepped down from the podium. The room shifted with him, not just physically, but symbolically. The man once assaulted silently at 30,000 feet was now the voice guiding the industry toward a higher standard. At the edge of the hallway, his hand brushed the lapel of his blazer, the same one he'd worn on the flight. A small thread still hung loose near the shoulder. He hadn't cut it. It reminded him of the moment the world tipped. The pain, the restraint, the truth. He stopped briefly before the exit, looking over the crowd one last time. The moment came back in full clarity. The elbow, the whisper, the humiliation designed to fracture him. But now it was different. Now it was history. The incident meant to weaken him became the spark that strengthened countless others. He attacked, and froze as the CEO grabbed the elbow and bent it backward in one swift motion, leaving the cabin stunned. If you believe true authority doesn't wait for permission, it enforces. Subscribe now. Because justice always lands first and strongest. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, prejudice, and the power of composure and strategic action in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and respect for every passenger.